I remember the music first. Polite strings drifting across a ballroom, where the air smelled like lemon polish and expensive perfume, and then the sight that knocked the breath out of me. At the center table, directly across from the CEO, a young woman with lacquered nails crossed her legs and rested a possessive hand on my husband's sleeve. The place card in front of her sparkled under the chandelier bold black font where my name was supposed to be. Daniel glanced up at me with the kind of quick, guilty look a person gives a fire alarm they hope no one else hears. He leaned toward her, then toward me, measuring which face would be easier to calm in public. "Evelyn, maybe sit toward the side tonight," he said, and the word maybe was a formality that landed like a verdict. I felt the whole room adjust itself forks, pausing midair, small smiles turning curious, and I realized the celebration of his big year had also apparently been the end of mine. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight and tap the like and subscribe if stories about quiet justice and second chances keep you company. I promise to keep names consistent and the truth as steady as a heartbeat. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I grew up in a house where you kept your word and you kept your receipts, because one day you might need both. My parents were teachers, the kind who stretched Sunday stew to Tuesday and still found $20 for a field trip. And they taught me that love isn't loud, it's consistent. I met Daniel at a charity 5K the summer I turned 26. He was all sleeves rolled to the forearm, and fast promises a young analyst with big city hunger and a smile that made people lean in. I had a stable job writing grant proposals and a habit of checking that the doors were locked twice. He had the kind of ambition that keeps a person awake even when they sleep. We married in a small church with borrowed flowers and a reception where my aunt called us a good match. His spark, my ballast, two halves that might balance if we were careful. For a while, we were careful. We rented a drafty apartment with a view of brick and sky, and when his firm offered a low salary but a foot in the door, I did the math and made it work. When a modest inheritance from my parents arrived, I pushed for a down payment on a quiet 2-bedroom near the river, a place where someday a bike could lean against a hallway wall without anyone complaining. Daniel wanted us both on the deed. I told myself it was about unity, not optics, and signed. We had Lily 2 years later, and the apartment filled with cereal bowls and paper crowns, the reliably messy proofs of a life that felt honest. If he worked late, I chalked it up to ladder climbing the same way I accepted that sometimes my grants would go to programs I'd never see. We chose the future over the present, and it seemed noble, even romantic, to live on the promise of what we were building. Little cracks arrived politely at first. Daniel became particular about his phone, setting it face down like a sleeping pet. He joined a gym across town, despite the one downstairs being perfectly adequate, and he started speaking about appearances, the way some people talk about the weather, safe, ordinary, constant. I am not a woman who snoops, and I am not a woman who guesses twice when facts will do, but a late receipt tucked into a pocket and a photo from a firm event made me pause. In that photo, a young assistant stood a touch too close to him, her laugh opening toward his face as if he were saying something hilarious and private. I remember thinking nothing decisive, just that my stomach felt cold the way it does when you step outside on an April morning and find winter hasn't left. On the night of the gala, I took Lily to my sister's house and let her fuss with my earrings before I left. The way little girls do when they still believe beauty comes from shiny things. I had the dress altered at the waist, a quiet favor to myself after years of being practical, and the mirror showed a woman who had earned the right to sit in her own chair. The ballroom was built to flatter all gold and cream, and I walked toward our reserved table with a small, practiced smile. Then I saw the card. In place of Evelyn Hart, the name Tessa Cole gleamed like a dare. Daniel's jaw tightened. A single muscle jumped near his temple, and his apology, if it was one, came dressed as logistics. "It's better for appearances," he said, and the word better floated between us like a paper boat in deep water. Around us, Crystal chimed. Someone lifted a phone. I did not make a scene. I did not need to. I slipped a hand against the side of my clutch to steady myself and felt the familiar edges of the documents I had started gathering weeks earlier. Not because I wanted to use them, but because I wanted to remember who I was when the room tried to tell me otherwise. Every marriage has its language. Ours had become a series of calendar blocks and polite nods, a careful choreography that left no space for grief to show. I stood very still and tasted lemon from the polish in the air, and I understood that silence can humiliate as surely as shouting can. A woman at the next table, one who had complimented my shoes last Christmas, shifted in her chair and looked at me with something like pity, and that was the moment I felt the heat drain away, leaving something clearer in its place. I turned from the table without touching the chair meant for me, and let the chandeliers do their shimmering without my consent. In the hallway, the air was cooler, less perfumed, and the long mirror by the elevator returned a version of me that looked exactly the same and nothing alike. I pressed the call button and watched the numbers descend every floor, a small drumbeat that made my breathing even. When the doors opened, I stepped inside with my clutch tucked close and the steadiness of someone who has found the line she will not let the world cross. Part 1 ends here at the beginning of an unmaking, with a center table behind me and a promise in my hand. In Part 2, I will tell you what I did next. When the elevator doors slid shut, the reflection staring back at me was composed, but my pulse throbbed in my throat. I kept replaying the moment the way Daniel's hand had stayed on the table, instead of reaching for mine, the way her smile curled, as though she had been given something that was mine by right. My name card tossed aside, as though I had never earned it, lingered in my mind like a mocking echo. Outside, the ballroom had erupted into whispers and camera flashes, but here in the stillness of steel and glass, the silence pressed in heavier than applause ever could. That night, when I stepped through our condo door, the city lights glittered against the glass, but the place felt stripped of warmth. I set my bag on the counter, the leather heavier than it should have been, carrying more than lipstick and a phone. Inside it sat the folder I had pieced together for months, a reluctant archive of late receipts, bank withdrawals that made no sense, and emails I had stumbled across when his carelessness betrayed him. I had never wanted to use them, but I had collected them all the same, an instinct I couldn't explain at the time. Now I knew why. They were more than papers. They were proof. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen island, staring at the same granite where Lily had once pressed cookie cutters into dough. That memory collided with the one from the gala, and my chest tightened. I had spent 12 years protecting Daniel's image, hosting dinners where colleagues called me the steady hand behind his success. I had missed birthdays at the office because he asked me to understand the long hours, and I had swallowed the sting of cold dinners gone uneaten. Tonight, he had returned that devotion with a single phrase, "Sit at the side table." It rang louder in my ears than the string quartet ever had. I thought back to when we first met, two young dreamers, me with cautious plans and him with charm that filled every room. He had promised we'd make a life worth admiring. I had believed him so completely that I even offered my inheritance to buy this home, telling myself it was our shared foundation. But his pride insisted on both names on the deed, and I let it happen, thinking unity mattered more than technicalities. Now staring across our silent condo, I wondered if that decision had been my greatest mistake. I had funded the life he flaunted, and tonight he had offered my seat to someone else, like it was nothing more than a decoration. The next morning, Lily padded into the kitchen in her socks' hair, sticking out in every direction, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She asked why I had picked her up from Aunt Maggie's so late, and I kissed her forehead, telling her it had just been a long night. Her innocence was a shield, but also a wound. I could protect her from the details, but not from the truth that lingered in the edges of her questions. Not long ago, she had asked why her father smiled at the lady with the shiny nails differently than he smiled at me. That memory cut deeper now, because it meant she had seen what I had tried to ignore. The folder remained on the counter all morning, and I traced the edges with my fingers as though touching it might give me courage. I remembered one receipt in particular for champagne, and a dessert built for two from a rooftop bar I had never stepped foot in. I remembered a string of emails ordinary in wording, but intimate in their frequency, that made me feel like a guest in my own marriage. I had tucked each page away quietly, unsure if I had the strength to face them. But last night at the gala had stripped away any illusions. The evidence wasn't a secret anymore. It was armor, and I would need every piece of it. Daniel returned home well past noon, his suit still smelling faintly of the cologne he saved for firm events. He didn't look triumphant, as I expected. He looked cornered. "Evelyn," he began, but his voice trailed off when he saw the papers spread across the counter. For a moment, silence stretched between us like glass about to shatter. I wanted him to admit it, to at least offer a truth I didn't have to pry from him, but he said nothing. He set his briefcase down and muttered something about meetings as though the night before hadn't happened in full view of his colleagues. That cowardice, his refusal to even acknowledge what everyone else had already witnessed, lit something sharper in me than grief. It was contempt. That evening, after Lily went to bed, I sat at the window with the skyline glittering beyond the glass. I thought about every hour I had spent waiting for him, every late night I had explained away, every quiet meal where I told myself his absence was temporary. Those sacrifices had not been for nothing. They had built a family, a home, a stability I had wanted so badly for our daughter. But last night proved that in his world, I was expendable. My place could be reassigned with a printed card. That realization burned away the last of my denial. The betrayal wasn't hidden anymore. It was public, and it was final. I whispered to myself, as though saying the words would make them real, no more excuses. This wasn't about saving a marriage anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, and more importantly, about protecting Lily from believing that love was something you had to beg for. The ache of humiliation was still fresh, but underneath it, a steadier resolve began to take root. I could see the path forming sharp and unavoidable. I would not play the part of the loyal wife who looked the other way. I would not let him decide how the story of our life was told. That night, I slid the folder back into my bag, not as a burden, but as a weapon. The papers rustled like matches waiting for flame, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I struck them. Daniel slept in the guest room, the silence between us so heavy it felt like a wall. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, and let the clarity settle. He thought humiliating me at a gala was the worst I could endure. He had no idea what was coming, and with that thought, I closed my eyes, steady for the first time in months. The betrayal had been exposed. What came next would be my answer. In the quiet days that followed the gala, I carried myself as though nothing had shifted. But inside, I felt like I was walking across a frozen lake, listening for cracks beneath the surface. Every morning, I packed Lily's lunch, answered emails, and moved through the routines that gave her stability. Yet beneath that calm exterior, humiliation sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. I replayed the moment Daniel asked me to sit aside, the way his words cut more deeply than if he had shouted, and I felt the ache all over again. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was how easily he let the world see me as disposable. At night, when the house finally quieted and Lily drifted into dreams, I would sit at the kitchen table, surrounded by the folder's contents. Receipts for dinners I never attended. Hotel charges that made no sense, and statements showing money trickling from accounts we had built together. I would run my fingers across the numbers, each one sharp as glass, and wonder how many meals, how many school shoes, how many small joys had been traded for someone else's amusement. The silence of the condo deepened those questions, each paper a reminder that while I had been steady, he had been reckless. I kept everything in order, labeled and dated, but the more organized it became, the more it felt like I was cataloging my own pain. The hardest moments weren't when I was alone. They were when Lily noticed things I wished she hadn't. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me with her serious brown eyes and asked why Daddy wasn't home again. I told her he was working late, the same explanation I had used for years, but this time she frowned. "He's always smiling when that lady talks to him at the office," she whispered, clutching her rabbit. "He doesn't smile at you like that." My heart clenched. I smoothed her hair and kissed her cheek, but the truth in her observation pierced deeper than any receipt ever could. Children see what adults try to ignore, and she had already seen too much. I didn't cry in front of her. I saved that for the bathroom, where the sound of the shower masked everything. There, I would let the tears fall until my face burned, then wash it all away before stepping back into the hallway. It became a ritual I hated but couldn't stop. Each night, I told myself I needed to be strong, yet each night, the weight of his betrayal pulled me under. In those hidden hours, I questioned everything: my worth as a partner, my judgment, even the foundation I had thought our marriage stood on. I told myself I had sacrificed too much for it to crumble now, but deep down, I knew I was only postponing the inevitable. Sometimes when Daniel finally came home past midnight, I pretended to sleep. I would hear the shuffle of his shoes against the hardwood, the clink of a glass poured too hastily, and the muffled sound of him moving through the guest room. The distance between us was no longer invisible. It was a canyon. He never reached for me, never offered an explanation or an apology. That silence was its own confession. I would lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and feel the quiet ache of realizing that the man beside me was gone, even when he was in the next room. The mornings after were the hardest. I would find traces of his nights out, an unfamiliar cologne clinging to his shirt, a receipt shoved hastily into a pocket, or simply the way his eyes avoided mine when Lily asked if he was joining us for breakfast. He would mutter something about a meeting, kiss her on the top of her head, and leave without touching me. Each time, I swallowed the sting for her sake, telling myself that she deserved at least one parent who showed up consistently. I folded her school uniform, braided her hair, and smiled as though everything was fine. But inside, the bitterness grew sharper, like a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. I began keeping a journal late at night, not for reflection, but for survival. Each entry was a small act of defiance against the silence. I wrote about the way I felt standing in that ballroom, about Lily's innocent question, about the moments when I wanted to scream, but didn't. Putting the words on paper steadied me in a way that crying never could. It was as if I was collecting not only evidence of his betrayal, but also a record of my endurance. I didn't know if anyone else would ever read it, but I knew one day I would look back and see how far I had come. Even as the days blurred, small sparks of clarity began to flicker. I realized that the humiliation at the gala had not broken me. It had revealed him. The woman who carried the bag that night was not the same woman who had walked into that ballroom. My reflection in the elevator mirror had shown me eyes that no longer belonged to someone content with excuses. That truth frightened me, but it also steadied me. I was learning that beneath the pain, there was a strength I had long forgotten, a quiet power waiting to be claimed. Daniel still tried to keep up appearances. He spoke at dinners with colleagues as if nothing had changed, and he sent out emails about new projects, his tone confident and controlled. But behind closed doors, he avoided me entirely, as though silence could erase what had been seen by so many. What he didn't understand was that the silence gave me space to think, and in that space, the pain I carried began to harden into resolve. I no longer needed his words to confirm what I already knew. His absence spoke louder than anything he could have said. There were moments when the weight of it nearly crushed me, times when I looked at the condo I had bought, the life I had built, and wondered if I had wasted years on someone who never valued it. But then I would hear Lily's laughter drifting from her room, see her artwork taped to the fridge, or feel her small hand slip into mine as we crossed the street. Those reminders pulled me back to what mattered. This fight wasn't only about reclaiming my dignity, it was about protecting her from growing up believing that betrayal was normal, that silence was love. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo. The pain was too heavy, the humiliation too raw, and the evidence too clear. I had carried the weight quietly, but silence had given him power. It was time to shift that balance. I folded the papers back into the folder and slid it into my bag once more, this time, not as a burden, but as a promise. I no longer felt like a woman drowning. I felt like a woman waiting at the edge of a storm, ready to decide which direction the wind would blow. The night I finally admitted the truth to myself, I sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed. The papers from the folder were spread across the surface, like evidence in a courtroom, and the city lights flickered across them, turning each line of numbers into a reminder I couldn't escape. My chest no longer ached the way it had before. Instead, there was a clarity I hadn't felt in years, sharp and steady. Daniel's betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, no longer something I tried to explain away. It was fact, and once faced facts have a way of sharpening your vision. I thought back to that elevator ride after the gala, staring into the polished steel doors and seeing eyes that were harder than I remembered. That reflection hadn't been lying. I wasn't the same woman who once swallowed excuses in the name of keeping peace. The humiliation had cracked something open, and what poured through was not despair. It was resolve. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what life would look like without him. I was more afraid of what it would look like if I stayed. The next morning, I moved through the house with a different kind of composure. I brewed my coffee, packed Lily's lunch, and answered her questions about school as though nothing had changed. But inside, every movement was charged with purpose. When Daniel brushed past me on his way to the door, muttering about an early meeting, I didn't shrink from his indifference. I simply noted the scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his jacket and let it roll off me. The old Evelyn would have pretended not to notice, would have waited for him to offer a thin excuse. The woman standing in that kitchen now no longer needed his explanations. I called Margaret Lewis that afternoon. She had handled estate matters for a colleague of mine, and I remembered the calm authority in her voice when she spoke. I told her I needed guidance, and she asked me to come by her office the next day. Hanging up the phone, I felt a surprising steadiness. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't panicked. I was simply taking the first step on a road I had long delayed. That evening, as Lily worked on a drawing at the kitchen table, I sat beside her, the smell of crayons filling the air. She asked if Daddy would be home for dinner. I told her no, and for the first time, I didn't offer a cover story. I said simply that he was making choices that kept him away, but that she and I would be fine. She looked at me with quiet curiosity, then nodded and returned to her drawing. Watching her, I realized she didn't need me to protect her from every truth. She needed me to show her what strength looked like. The following day, I walked into Margaret's office carrying the folder. Her desk was neat, her manner brisk, but kind, and as she flipped through the documents, she nodded without surprise. "You've done more of the work than most clients ever do," she said. "This will make everything easier." I sat across from her, my hands folded, and for once I didn't feel ashamed. I felt prepared. She explained the options, freezing accounts, filing motions, documenting every financial inconsistency. It was the language of action, and it steadied me more than any apology ever could have. That night, when Daniel's text came short, almost casual, asking if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend, I didn't reply. The old Evelyn would have felt torn, caught between anger and a desperate hope that he might finally see me. Now I saw the message for what it was, another attempt at keeping control. I placed the phone face down on the table and returned to the documents I had signed that morning. His words no longer carried weight. The paper trail did. As the week passed, I began to see myself differently. Walking Lily to school, I noticed the way my shoulders no longer slumped when other parents asked about Daniel's long hours. At the grocery store, I caught my reflection in the freezer doors and saw someone who looked calm, even dignified, rather than weary. The awakening wasn't loud. It was quiet and steady, a shift I felt in my posture, in my tone, in the way I no longer rushed to cover his absence with excuses. One night, as I tucked Lily into bed, she whispered, "You seem happier, Mom." The words startled me, but I realized she was right. Happiness wasn't the word I would have chosen, but there was a kind of lightness in finally facing the truth. I kissed her forehead and told her that sometimes being honest with yourself makes everything feel clearer. She nodded satisfied with that answer and drifted off to sleep while I sat beside her, marveling at the wisdom children can uncover without even trying. By the end of the week, I had begun putting small safeguards in place. I changed the passwords on accounts, moved some personal savings to an account in my name only, and gathered documents that proved where the money for our condo had come from. Each action felt less like vengeance and more like protection for myself, for Lily, for the years of work I had poured into holding this family together. Daniel was too wrapped up in his performance at the office to notice. He still walked through the door some nights with the same cologne, the same carefully practiced smile, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. I didn't confront him then. Confrontation had been the language of our old life, me questioning him, deflecting. I didn't need another argument. What I needed was a plan, and now I had one. The clarity I felt sitting in Margaret's office had lit a fire in me, but it wasn't a fire of rage. It was purpose, steady, and unstoppable. That Saturday morning, as the city woke outside our windows, I stood with a cup of coffee in hand and let the light spill across the room. For the first time in months, I felt no tremor in my chest, no question gnawing at my mind. The betrayal had been acknowledged. The pain had been carried. Now the path forward stretched ahead, and I was ready to walk it. Once the clarity set and my movements changed, I no longer drifted through the days hoping Daniel would return to me as the man he once pretended to be. Instead, I moved deliberately, quietly, laying the groundwork for what came next. I didn't announce anything, didn't argue or plead. I simply began to reclaim what was mine, one step at a time. To anyone watching, I was still the same calm woman running errands and packing school lunches. But beneath that surface, every choice was precise, aimed at dismantling the illusion Daniel had built. My first call was to the bank. Margaret had explained what documents I needed and how to phrase my request so that there would be no delay. Sitting across from the branch manager, I slid copies of the suspicious withdrawals and transfers across his desk. My voice never wavered as I explained the pattern of unauthorized activity. He nodded, typed into his computer, and within minutes, the joint accounts were frozen. By the time Daniel swiped his card at lunch the next day, he would discover that access was no longer guaranteed. I left the branch feeling lighter than I had in months. There was no outburst, no shouting match, only a signature on a form and a system set quietly in motion. That was how I wanted it. Not rage, but precision. Back at home, I gathered Lily's essentials and packed a small bag for her to keep at my sister Maggie's house. A few changes of clothes, her favorite chapter books, the stuffed rabbit that had comforted her through every storm. I told her it was just in case she wanted to spend a weekend with her cousins. She lit up at the idea, unaware of the larger storm gathering around us. Protecting her meant making sure her life stayed steady, even as mine shifted underneath. The condo, though, was harder. Every corner carried pieces of my sacrifice, the down payment pulled from my inheritance, the nights I had stayed up late making sure bills were paid on time, the small touches I had added to make it feel like home. But I knew clinging to the space would only keep me tethered to a life that no longer existed. So I called the real estate agent I had once spoken to, in passing, a woman named Caroline Doyle, who specialized in discreet fast listings. When I told her what I wanted, she didn't ask for explanations. She simply said, "I'll handle it," and scheduled a photographer for the following week. In the days that followed, I worked quietly through a checklist. I changed the locks one afternoon while Daniel was out, the sound of the drill sharp but satisfying. I transferred what personal savings I could to a new account in my name alone, one Daniel couldn't touch. I set up two-factor authentication on every email, every cloud account, every document we once shared. Each step was small, almost invisible, but together they formed a wall he couldn't see yet. A wall that would close around him before he even realized it was there. Daniel, of course, noticed something was wrong when his card was declined. He called me the next morning, his voice sharp with confusion. "Why are the accounts frozen?" he demanded. I listened steady and said only, "You made your choices. I'm making mine." Then I ended the call. For once, I didn't let his panic pull me into a spiral. The power of silence was stronger than any argument. That day, I felt the first ripple of consequence. A colleague texted me a joke about a card reader refusing a charge, and I realized how quickly news traveled in his world. The image of Daniel trying to brush off a declined payment in front of a client made me almost pity him. But pity was a luxury I no longer had. I wasn't aiming to embarrass him for sport. I was aiming to dismantle the foundation he had used to stand over me. At work, I kept my composure, reviewing grant applications and answering calls as though nothing unusual was happening in my personal life. Yet beneath the hum of ordinary tasks, I carried the satisfaction of knowing I had struck the first blow. No one else needed to see the evidence for me to know it was real. The numbers in those statements had already spoken louder than any confession Daniel might ever offer. One evening, after Lily was asleep, I sat at the kitchen island with a notebook and began mapping out the next steps. Margaret had advised me to document everything: emails, receipts, even the photographs of items I moved into storage. So I did. I photographed jewelry I had purchased with my own money, time-stamped the images, and uploaded them to a secure folder. I kept a log of every call, every transfer, every conversation with Daniel. Not because I doubted my memory, but because I knew the day would come when proof mattered more than pain. The strangest part of those days was how calm I felt. I had expected rage, or at least the trembling nervousness of someone crossing a line. Instead, there was a steadiness in me that I hadn't known in years. Each action, however small, reminded me that I wasn't powerless. I was not the woman standing at the side table while another took my place. I was the woman quietly rewriting the script of my own life. Daniel tried to reach me again that weekend. He showed up at the condo, knocking on the door, his voice muffled but urgent. I watched him through the security feed, pacing in the lobby, gesturing at the concierge as though he could will the locks back into his control. I didn't open the door. Instead, I watched him leave in frustration, his shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen before. That image stayed with me not as a source of triumph, but as a reminder that the balance was shifting. Lily noticed the changes in small ways. She asked why Daddy wasn't around as much, why we had new locks on the door. I told her that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and it's important to make sure we feel safe at home. She seemed to accept that her innocence shielding her from the larger truth. Protecting her from the full weight of Daniel's betrayal was the one thing I was determined not to fail at. By the end of that week, the condo was scheduled to be staged, the accounts were secure, and Margaret had the first filings ready to go. I had taken the first steps into a different life, one where silence was no longer weakness, but strategy. Daniel still thought he was in control, still thought his charm and his career would shield him. But he hadn't realized yet how quickly a reputation unravels when the foundation beneath it has been pulled away. The first real fracture came not in our home, but out in public, where Daniel had always counted on admiration to shield him. A few nights after I froze the accounts, he appeared at a restaurant where I was dining with my sister Maggie and her husband. He walked in with Tessa at his side, dressed as though they were on display, his smile polished for the crowd. The moment his shadow fell across our table, the air shifted. Forks stilled, conversations faded, and I could feel every pair of eyes turn toward us. He greeted me with false warmth, using the same voice he reserved for clients asking if we could step outside for a private word. I didn't rise from my chair. I cut into my steak, took my time chewing, and then met his gaze with a calm steadiness I knew he hadn't expected. "You've had months to talk," I told him. "You used that time to lie. Why would tonight be any different?" Laughter rippled across nearby tables. Tessa's smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her purse like a shield. Daniel pressed on, insisting we think of Lily, that dragging matters into the open would harm her. At the mention of her name, I stood. My chair scraped against the floor loud enough to silence the room entirely. "Do not bring her into this," I said clearly. "She is the only one I am protecting." His face flushed, but I didn't give him space to recover. From my bag, I pulled a sheet of paper, one of the highlighted credit card statements, and held it high enough for the nearest tables to see. "This," I announced, "is what my husband considers a business expense. Thousands spent on hotels and jewelry while I raised our daughter and kept our home intact." Gasps carried through the room, followed by the unmistakable hum of phones, capturing every second. Tessa tugged at his arm, whispering for him to leave, but Daniel shook her off, pride outweighing sense. When I turned and addressed the crowd one last time, my voice carried without strain. "If you ever wondered what betrayal costs, watch closely." Then I gathered my bag, kissed my sister's cheek, and walked out into the night while the applause and murmurs rose behind me. By morning, the clip had spread across social media. Friends sent me screenshots of captions, "Receipts don't lie. She's a legend." Local pages dissected every word, while colleagues whispered about the man whose wife had just rewritten his story in front of 50 witnesses. Daniel tried to spin it quickly, arranging an interview on a business podcast where he framed me as a stressed wife lashing out unfairly. I listened steady as he called the gala a misunderstanding and the restaurant an overreaction. His words sounded rehearsed, carefully measured, but beneath them was desperation. What he hadn't accounted for was evidence. The documents Margaret had filed for our motions became public record. Court clerks whispered, and before long, Photographs of his emails and invoices began to circulate. One message in particular spread like wildfire, the promise he had made to Tessa about moving money around so she could quit her job quietly. His attempt at control collapsed under the weight of his own handwriting. The firm had no choice but to react. Within days, they announced he would be taking an indefinite leave of absence. Whispers in the office turned into open avoidance, colleagues deleting their old congratulatory posts and clients pulling back from deals. Tessa vanished from social media, her once bright presence reduced to silence. Rumors spread that HR had begun asking questions, and soon after, she disappeared from the building entirely. Family began to take sides as well. Maggie called every evening, her voice firm with support, reminding me that I wasn't alone. My mother reached out quietly, asking if I felt safe, and offering her house as a place to retreat. Even my father, never one for long conversations, sent a simple message: "If you need anything, you say the word." Daniel's family, however, grew quiet. His brother tried once to call, but the pauses in his voice betrayed where his loyalties now leaned. Even his parents, once eager to boast about their son's accomplishments, no longer answered his calls. The humiliation built layer by layer. At the office cafeteria, Daniel became the man others avoided. At lunches, clients paid in cash rather than risk sitting through another decline transaction. Online, his name was paired with memes mocking integrity speeches he had once given. By the end of the week, he was not just embarrassed, he was unraveling. And all I had done was show what he had already written with his own hands. Through it all, I stayed focused on Lily. She colored at the kitchen table, humming to herself, asking only why her father sounded worried when he called. I told her gently that grown-ups sometimes make choices that bring consequences, but that she and I would be all right. She nodded, untroubled, and went back to her drawing. Protecting that innocence mattered more to me than any headline. The night Daniel showed up at the condo, pounding on the concierge desk when told the locks had been changed, I didn't even rise from the couch. I watched the security feed as he stormed away. His suit wrinkled, his posture broken. It was a small image, but one that told me how far the balance had shifted. He had been the man who once controlled every room he entered. Now, he was locked out of his own home, exposed under fluorescent lights, where everyone could see him falter. By the weekend, his desperation deepened. Flowers arrived at Maggie's house. His name scrawled on the card, asking me to call. I ignored them. He followed with text messages, alternating between anger and pleading. I left each one unanswered. The silence was more powerful than any reply I could give. He wanted to negotiate, to spin, to salvage appearances. But appearances were already gone. The truth was no longer just mine to hold. It had been placed into the hands of every colleague, every client, every stranger with a phone. And once the truth takes root in public, no interview, no bouquet of flowers, no rehearsed apology can erase it. The weeks after the restaurant incident carried a momentum of their own. Daniel tried to fight the current, but every attempt only pulled him under further. His podcast interview, meant to paint me as unstable, collapsed when the leaked emails surfaced. His firm issued a quiet statement about an internal review, then announced he was on indefinite leave. Behind those careful words was the truth everyone already knew. His career was crumbling, and the walls he had built around his reputation were gone. Margaret moved quickly, filing for divorce, with motions that left little room for argument. She presented the credit card statements, the bank withdrawals, and the receipts I had kept for months. She even included photographs I had taken of our belongings, each one labeled and time-stamped. When we stood in court for the first hearing, Daniel tried to posture, showing up in his best suit, chin lifted, as though the judge were just another client to impress. But the moment Margaret laid the papers on the table, his confidence faltered. The judge looked at him over the rim of her glasses and said plainly, "Mr. Hart, this isn't a press release. This is a court of law." Temporary custody of Lily was granted to me without hesitation. The judge read through his late-night messages to Tessa, the promises of secret money transfers, and his absences from home. Daniel's lawyer tried to argue for shared custody, but the contradiction between his words and his actions was impossible to ignore. I walked out of that courthouse with Lily's future secure, and with the first confirmation that his power no longer outweighed the truth. The condo was next. Carolyn staged it beautifully, removing traces of us and turning it into something sleek and neutral. It sold in less than 2 weeks, half the profit wired directly to me because the down payment had come from my inheritance. The other half was frozen by the court until the settlement. When Daniel begged for a release of funds, the judge allowed him only a modest stipend, barely enough for rent on a 1-bedroom apartment. I thought of all the years he had boasted about imported whiskey and tailored suits, and now he was reduced to arguing about utility bills. The irony was sharp, but I didn't smile. This wasn't about amusement, it was about justice. News spread quickly through his firm. What began as whispers became certainty. His leave of absence became a termination wrapped in the sterile language of moving forward. They offered him severance, but only under the condition he sign an NDA. Even that payment never fully reached him. By the time child support, legal fees, and temporary spousal support were deducted, he was left with scraps of what had once been an impressive income. His world, once measured in bonuses and promotions, was now carved into court-ordered obligations. Tessa didn't last long either. HR concluded their review and escorted her out of the building with a simple email and a security guard. She moved out of the condo soon after, taking with her nothing but the embarrassment of being linked to his downfall. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she was working retail in another city, trying to start over with no social media presence, no glamorous facade, and whispers that followed her wherever she went. Daniel's family began to show their distance in quieter ways. His father, who once raised a glass at every holiday to toast his son's success, stopped returning calls. His mother told Maggie in passing that she didn't know what to say to him anymore. Even his brother, who had tried early on to smooth things over, pulled away completely after seeing the filings. In their eyes, he was no longer a victim of gossip. He was the source of his own disgrace. Through all of it, I focused on Lily. I kept her routine, steady school playdates, bedtime stories, so that the chaos never touched her directly. When she asked where her father was, I told her the truth in words a child could hold. He's living somewhere else right now, because adults sometimes make choices that hurt families. She considered that for a moment, then nodded and returned to her coloring. Her resilience reminded me daily why every step mattered. She didn't need to carry the weight of his mistakes. That was mine to handle, and I was handling it. By the time summer came, the divorce was finalized. The settlement was clear. Assets divided, custody, secured accounts monitored by the court. What had once been our shared life, a home savings, a polished image, was reduced to paperwork that left him with debts and obligations, while I walked away with independence and stability for Lily. The judge's gavel falling that final day wasn't just an ending, it was a release. I walked out of that courtroom knowing the man who had tried to humiliate me in public had been stripped of every advantage he once wielded. Daniel called once more after the ruling. His voice was quieter this time, stripped of the arrogance I had known for so long. He asked to meet at the empty condo before the keys were turned over. Against my first instinct, I agreed. Some endings I felt needed to be spoken aloud. When I arrived, the rooms echoed with emptiness. The walls were bare, the air heavy with dust and memory. He stood in the living room, shoulders slumped, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow. "I know I don't deserve it," he began, "but I need you to hear me out." I set my bag on the counter and folded my arms. He spoke of mistakes, of selfishness, of not realizing what he had until it was gone. His voice cracked when he mentioned Lily, admitting that she barely spoke to him anymore. Tears filled his eyes, but I felt nothing stir in me. When he asked for another chance, I stepped closer, my voice steady. You destroyed us the moment you let her take my chair. You showed me where I stood, and I will never stand there again. His tears fell freely, then shoulders collapsing under the weight of his own words. I don't know who I am without you, he whispered. And I realized with absolute clarity that this was true. He wasn't mourning me. He was mourning the scaffolding I had built around him, the home, the image, the stability he had mistaken for his own strength. I picked up my bag, turned toward the door, and left him standing in the ruins of what he had made. The click of the lock behind me was final, more final than the judge's gavel. When I closed the door of that empty condo, I knew I was sealing more than just a chapter of my marriage. I was shutting away years of sacrifice that had been squandered, promises that had been broken, and a version of myself I no longer recognized. Daniel had been left behind in his own ruins, and I walked forward lighter, carrying only what truly mattered, my daughter and my dignity. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Without the constant tension of waiting for lies or excuses, my days settled into a rhythm that felt natural again. Lily and I moved into a smaller apartment near the Charles River, one filled not with expensive furniture, but with her artwork taped to the walls, and the sound of her laughter echoing down the hallway. In the evenings, we cooked together simple meals that somehow tasted richer, because there was no silence at the table. She began to ask deeper questions, braver ones, and I answered honestly in ways she could carry. What mattered most was that she saw her mother stand firm, and I knew she would grow up never mistaking loyalty for submission. Professionally, I returned to consulting work, the career I had set aside years ago so Daniel could climb his ladder. To my surprise, clients came quickly. Some had heard of my name in the news, others simply admired that I had not crumbled when tested. What once embarrassed me, the story of my humiliation, had transformed into a reputation for quiet strength. The same city that once whispered about me now opened its doors. It felt less like reinvention and more like reclaiming what I had always carried, but forgotten. Daniel drifted out of relevance. Word reached me now and then that he was picking up contract work, staying in short-term rentals, his once polished name now spoken only in cautionary tones. Even his parents kept their distance, and Tessa disappeared entirely. He had chased appearances until there was nothing left beneath them. I did not hate him anymore, nor did I pity him. He had chosen his path brick by brick, and I no longer stood in its shadow. What I carried instead was freedom. Freedom to shape a home without fear, to walk into a room without flinching, to teach my daughter what resilience looks like when the ground falls out from beneath you. Freedom to wake each morning and know that I am enough on my own. It is not a freedom that came easily. It was carved from betrayal, from humiliation, from nights when tears blurred the page of my journal. But it was worth every step. Looking back, I see clearly now that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is a bank account frozen with a signature, a lock changed on a door, a folder of receipts placed quietly in a lawyer's hand. Dignity is not restored in a single moment of triumph, but in the steady, deliberate choices that remind you of your own worth. My revenge was never about destroying him. It was about refusing to let him destroy me. Now when I stand by the window of our new home and watch the river glimmer below, I feel no bitterness. I feel peace. Betrayal had carved away the illusions, leaving space for something stronger, clearer, and truer. Lily sometimes asks if I am happy. I tell her yes, because happiness isn't grand gestures. It is freedom, stability, and the quiet certainty that I will never again let someone else decide my value. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments And if stories of resilience and justice bring you comfort, stay connected here for more.